The year is 1950. A general stands before a map of Asia, his finger tracing a line from Korea to Vietnam, from China to Indonesia. Douglas MacArthur turns to Dwight Eisenhower with eyes that have seen 2 world wars and declares, "Ike, Europe isn't where this war will be decided. Asia is the spark that will set the entire world ablaze, and we're standing at ground zero." Eisenhower stares at the map, his mind racing through calculations of men, money, and missiles. What he says next will determine whether America plunges into decades of Asian conflicts or charts a different course entirely. This isn't just a conversation between 2 generals. It's a prophecy that will come true in ways neither man could fully predict. MacArthur saw it coming, the explosion of conflict across Asia that would consume American resources and lives for the next quarter century. Vietnam, Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, every nation a potential battlefield in the struggle between freedom and communism. He begged Eisenhower to understand the stakes before it was too late. But Eisenhower had a different fear altogether. What if MacArthur was right about the threat but catastrophically wrong about the solution? What if committing America to total war in Asia was exactly the mistake that would doom the West? The tension in that room was electric. 2 titans of American military power facing the most consequential strategic decision of the modern age. What happened next would echo through history, from the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan. MacArthur had spent 5 years in Asia by the time he issued his warning, 5 years that had transformed his understanding of global power in fundamental ways. From his headquarters in Tokyo, he watched with growing alarm as communism spread across the world's most populous continent like wildfire through dry grass. This wasn't theoretical geopolitics discussed in Washington conference rooms. This was reality unfolding before his eyes, and it terrified him. China had fallen in 1949, the most populous nation on earth now under Mao Zedong's communist control. MacArthur had watched it happen despite billions in American aid to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. He'd seen how communist forces could mobilize peasant armies, how they could promise land reform and social justice, how they could turn poverty and resentment into revolutionary fervor. The loss of China wasn't just a geopolitical setback. It was a catastrophe that shifted the entire balance of global power. Korea was teetering on the edge, split between a Soviet-backed communist North and an American-supported South. MacArthur's intelligence network reported constant military buildup north of the 38th parallel. Kim Il-sung was preparing something. MacArthur knew it in his bones, and when it came, the peninsula would explode into war. But MacArthur's vision extended far beyond Korea. He saw Indochina, where French colonial forces were losing ground to Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh communists. He saw Indonesia, the Philippines, Burma, Malaya, Thailand, every nation in Southeast Asia facing communist insurgencies or political movements aligned with Moscow and Beijing. He saw Japan, which he'd worked so hard to democratize, potentially threatened if the communist tide continued unchecked. When MacArthur presented his analysis to Eisenhower, he did so with maps covered in red arrows showing communist advances, intelligence reports detailing Soviet and Chinese aid to revolutionary movements, and population statistics that made his point devastatingly clear. Asia contained more than half the world's population. If it fell to communism, the West would be isolated and eventually overwhelmed. The Third World War will be fought in Asia, MacArthur declared with absolute conviction. Not in the streets of Berlin or the fields of Europe, but in the rice paddies of Korea, the jungles of Indochina, and the islands of the Pacific. Europe is already divided and frozen. Asia is where the real battle for humanity's future will be decided, and we're losing it right now. MacArthur argued that America needed to commit fully to defending Asia, to drawing clear lines that communism couldn't cross, to building up military forces and supporting anti-communist governments regardless of their flaws. Half measures wouldn't work. Diplomatic solutions were fantasies. The communists understood only strength and would exploit any sign of weakness or hesitation. Eisenhower listened to MacArthur's passionate presentation with the careful attention he'd learned during years of coalition warfare. He asked probing questions about logistics, sustainability, political will, and strategic alternatives. He studied the maps and read the intelligence reports. And as MacArthur spoke, Eisenhower began forming a response that would define their fundamental disagreement. Eisenhower's mind worked differently than MacArthur's, shaped by different experiences and responsibilities. Where MacArthur saw military problems requiring military solutions, Eisenhower saw a complex equation involving economics, politics, public opinion, alliance management, and the terrifying new reality of nuclear weapons. He'd commanded coalition forces in Europe, which meant he understood something MacArthur often dismissed, that military power alone couldn't solve political problems. As he listened to MacArthur's dire predictions about Asia, Eisenhower was running calculations. America had roughly 150 million people and the world's strongest economy, but it was already supporting the reconstruction of Western Europe through the Marshall Plan, maintaining occupation forces in Germany and Japan, building NATO, and developing increasingly expensive nuclear weapons programs. How much more could the country sustain? MacArthur was proposing, essentially, that America become the policeman of Asia, a continent with hundreds of millions of people, thousands of miles of difficult terrain, complex ethnic and religious divisions, and nationalist movements that would resist any form of foreign control, even when it came wrapped in anti-communist rhetoric. The costs would be astronomical, not just in dollars, but in American lives. Eisenhower had another concern that kept him awake at night. The Soviet Union was developing nuclear weapons and would soon have enough to threaten American cities. The era of America's nuclear monopoly was ending. This meant that any major war, even one that started conventionally in Asia, could escalate into nuclear exchanges that would kill tens of millions and possibly end human civilization. "Doug," Eisenhower said carefully, choosing his words with precision, "I don't disagree that Asia matters. I don't disagree that communism is spreading and that it poses a real threat to our interests and our values, but I question whether we can afford to fight the kind of total war you're describing across an entire continent." Eisenhower laid out his counter-argument methodically. First, America needed to prioritize. Europe was more important strategically because it contained the industrial capacity and technological expertise that could threaten America if it fell under Soviet control. Asia, for all its population, was largely pre-industrial and didn't pose the same immediate strategic threat. Second, nationalism was a force MacArthur was underestimating. Asian peoples had spent centuries under European colonialism and were determined to control their own destinies. Any American military intervention would be seen through that lens, as another form of foreign domination, which would undermine the very cause America was trying to support. Third, and most importantly, the nuclear age required restraint. "We can't fight World War III in Asia," Eisenhower argued, "because World War III would mean nuclear war, and nuclear war means the end of everything we're trying to protect. We need to find ways to compete with the Soviets that don't risk mutual annihilation." Eisenhower proposed an alternative strategy: containment but not confrontation, support for allies but not open-ended military commitments, economic aid and political pressure rather than massive troop deployments, and above all, avoiding the kind of total war that could escalate beyond anyone's control. MacArthur listened with barely concealed frustration. To him, Eisenhower was being naive, underestimating the communist threat, and overestimating America's ability to compete without military force. "Ike, you're talking about managing a threat. I'm talking about defeating it. Those are two completely different strategies, and only one of them will actually work." On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in massive numbers, equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery, catching South Korean and American forces completely off guard. MacArthur's prediction had come true with devastating accuracy. Asia had ignited, and the Cold War had turned hot. President Truman immediately appointed MacArthur commander of United Nations forces in Korea. Finally, MacArthur had his chance to prove his strategic vision was correct, to demonstrate that decisive military action could stop communist expansion in Asia and send a message to Moscow and Beijing that aggression wouldn't be tolerated. MacArthur's execution of the Incheon landing in September 1950 was a masterpiece of military planning and audacity. Against overwhelming odds and over the objections of nearly every other military planner who called it impossible, MacArthur landed forces deep behind enemy lines at Incheon, cutting North Korean supply lines and turning the war's momentum completely. Within weeks, UN forces had recaptured Seoul and were pushing north toward the Chinese border. It seemed MacArthur had been vindicated. His aggressive strategy was working. Korea would be reunified under a democratic government, sending a powerful message that communist aggression wouldn't succeed. American military power, properly applied with bold leadership, could indeed reshape Asia. Eisenhower watched these developments with admiration for MacArthur's tactical brilliance. but growing concern about strategic direction. MacArthur was pushing toward the Yalu River, the border with China, dismissing warnings that this might provoke Chinese intervention. MacArthur believed the Chinese were bluffing, that they wouldn't dare confront American military might, that even if they did intervene, they could be defeated easily. On November 25, 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the Yalu River in one of the largest military interventions in modern history. They struck with overwhelming force, using human wave tactics and fighting with a fanaticism that shocked American commanders. UN forces were sent reeling backward in desperate retreat, suffering terrible casualties in brutal winter conditions. MacArthur's prediction that Asia would ignite the Cold War had been absolutely correct. His prediction that America could win decisively through superior firepower had been catastrophically wrong. The war that was supposed to demonstrate American resolve instead demonstrated the limits of American power. The conflict that was supposed to be over by Christmas became a grinding stalemate that would last 3 more years. Eisenhower's fears had also proven correct. The Korean War was consuming vast resources, killing thousands of Americans, and risking escalation into a much wider conflict. When MacArthur began publicly advocating for expanding the war into China, possibly using nuclear weapons, Truman faced an impossible choice between supporting his field commander and preventing World War III. The tension reached a breaking point when MacArthur continued to challenge presidential authority, making policy statements that contradicted Truman's directives and essentially demanding that he be allowed to fight the war his way without political interference. On April 11, 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of command in one of the most dramatic confrontations between civilian and military authority in American history. MacArthur returned home to a hero's welcome, addressing Congress with his famous farewell speech. But the war he'd predicted and tried to win continued as a bloody stalemate. Eisenhower's approach, containment without seeking total victory, became official policy. When Eisenhower became president in 1953, he ended the Korean War with an armistice that accepted division, exactly the outcome MacArthur had warned against and fought to prevent. MacArthur's broader prophecy about Asia continued to unfold with eerie accuracy even after his dismissal. The Korean War was just the beginning. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, exactly as MacArthur had predicted, communist movements and insurgencies erupted across Southeast Asia. The French were defeated in Indochina at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, leading to the division of Vietnam into Communist North and non-Communist South. Laos descended into civil war between Communist Pathet Lao forces and Royalist government troops. Cambodia's Sihanouk tried desperately to maintain neutrality while communists and anti-communists fought for influence. Indonesia's massive Communist Party, the PKI, became one of the largest in the world outside the communist bloc. The Philippines battled the Hukbalahap communist insurgency. Malaya fought a long counterinsurgency campaign against communist guerrillas. The domino theory, the idea that if one nation fell to communism its neighbors would follow, became the organizing principle of American foreign policy in Asia. It was essentially MacArthur's warning repackaged and officially adopted. Every administration from Eisenhower through Nixon operated on the assumption that MacArthur had been right about Asia being the central battleground of the Cold War. But they also tried to apply Eisenhower's caution about avoiding the kind of total war MacArthur had advocated. The result was a series of half measures, limited interventions, and proxy wars that satisfied neither approach. America committed enough to get deeply involved, but not enough to achieve decisive victory, exactly the scenario both MacArthur and Eisenhower had feared for different reasons. Vietnam became the ultimate test of MacArthur's prophecy and Eisenhower's counter-argument. Presidents Kennedy and Johnson committed American combat forces to prevent South Vietnam's fall to communism, gradually escalating from advisors to full-scale military operations, involving more than 500,000 American troops at the war's peak. MacArthur, watching from retirement, saw Vietnam as vindication of everything he'd warned about. America was fighting the Asian war he'd predicted, but fighting it with the limited war approach he'd argued would fail. If only they'd listened to him in 1950, if only they'd fought to win in Korea and prevented Chinese intervention, perhaps Vietnam wouldn't be necessary. If only they'd commit fully in Vietnam, use all available force, perhaps victory was still possible. But Eisenhower's concerns also proved prescient. The Vietnam War consumed American resources, divided the nation politically, killed more than 58,000 Americans, and ended in failure despite decades of effort and countless billions spent. The war that was supposed to prevent communist expansion in Southeast Asia instead demonstrated the limits of American power and will. When Saigon fell in 1975, it seemed to prove that Eisenhower had been right. Military force alone couldn't solve political problems, and attempting total war in Asia against nationalist movements fighting on their home territory was beyond America's capacity. Looking back through the long lens of history, the argument between MacArthur and Eisenhower about Asia reveals a paradox. MacArthur was right about the threat and wrong about the solution. Eisenhower was right about the limits of military power, but perhaps too cautious about demonstrating American resolve. Both men's prophecies came true in ways that validated their fears while undermining their proposed solutions. Asia did become the primary battleground of the Cold War, exactly as MacArthur predicted. More Americans died fighting in Korea and Vietnam than died fighting the Soviets directly, which is to say none died fighting the Soviets directly because the nuclear balance of terror prevented direct confrontation between the superpowers. The proxy wars MacArthur foresaw became the reality of Cold War competition. But America didn't achieve the decisive victories MacArthur believed were necessary and possible. Korea ended in stalemate and division that persists today. Vietnam ended in defeat and communist victory. Yet despite these setbacks, communism didn't sweep across all of Asia as the domino theory predicted. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines remained non-communist, and many became prosperous democracies or market economies. Eisenhower's strategy of containment, economic competition, and alliance building ultimately proved more successful than MacArthur's vision of military confrontation. The Cold War ended not because America won decisive military victories in Asia, but because the Soviet economic system collapsed under the weight of competition it couldn't sustain. China abandoned communist economics while maintaining communist politics, becoming integrated into global capitalism in ways that have created new challenges nobody in 1950 could have imagined. The conversation between MacArthur and Eisenhower about Asia established frameworks that still shape American foreign policy debates today. Hawks echo MacArthur's arguments about the need for strength, commitment, and willingness to use force decisively. Doves echo Eisenhower's warnings about the limits of military power, the risks of escalation, and the importance of understanding local nationalism and political complexity. Every American president since has had to navigate between these two poles, demonstrating enough strength to deter aggression without committing to conflicts that drain national resources and will. From Afghanistan to Iraq, from Taiwan to the South China Sea, the ghost of that 1950 argument haunts contemporary policy debates. MacArthur died in 1964, still believing history would vindicate him, still convinced that America had lost its will to win. Eisenhower lived until 1969, long enough to see Vietnam consuming the nation in exactly the way he'd feared, but also to see NATO and the Western alliance he'd helped build proving resilient and successful. Perhaps the truth is that both men were necessary voices in the debate. MacArthur's clarity about communist threats prevented complacency and forced America to take Asia seriously. Eisenhower's caution about military limits prevented World War III and nuclear catastrophe. The tension between their views, rather than the triumph of either approach, may have been exactly what America needed to navigate the dangerous decades of the Cold War without destroying itself or the world. If you want to explore more about MacArthur's incredible life, his conflicts with presidents, his brilliant victories and controversial defeats, and the other legendary generals who shaped the modern world, subscribe now. The stories of these men reveal not just military history, but the fundamental debates about American power that continue to define our world today.